Congratulations on your new
Thank you.
book. On your new book. The title again is Footnotes to
Uh,
Triangular Cartographies. Okay.
yes, this triangle refers to Brazil, Cuba, and Nigeria. It's
Mm,
about the book. It's about these invisible links between these three cultures that have the Yoruba traditional mythologies, knowledges, philosophy in common.
mhm,
So it's about all these, it's kind of the background of history because all these knowledges that are related to this knowledge of the unknown
mm,
are very marginalized, no, by this rational logic of that we live in. So
mm,
it's about like small stories and histories that I discovered in these three countries by talking to the people or by reading, by researching, and small stories that are very connected.
mm.
For example, just to give you that's not so abstract. When I was in Cuba, I was talking to a friend um, about Shango, and then because we found in a palm tree, we found some bananas hanging on the palm tree, and I found it weird why bananas
Mm.
are hanging in the palm
Yeah,
tree.
yeah.
And then she said it was because the imperial palm tree is the tree of Shango. So if you want to make an
Mm,
offer to Shango, you hang the bananas there, and Shango likes banana in Cuba.
mm,
So, and then we were talking about Shango and the palm tree, and she told me that Fidel Castro was a Shango worshipper, and that's
oh.
why he stayed so long in power, fighting for justice. And then I was just like, okay, this is something I never heard.
Yeah, that's something I never heard either. And it gives you such a different perspective on so many iconic things about Cuba, including like the figure of Castro himself. Wow,
Yeah,
amazing.
he had
Um,
this strong personality of a Shango person.
yeah, I can see that, right? And you would have to have like a literacy in understanding how the different orishas are characterized, like what their different characters are, to be able to associate it with a person in that way, like his personality in that way. So that's, and that too is an unknown, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
not everyone has that literacy. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, it's about these small details of connecting these dots. Also,
Mm,
like, and then by this scene that I lived, I started to unwrap also the role of the palm tree in the colonial period in Brazil, because it
mm,
was the imperial palm tree. The seed
mm,
was brought by the Portuguese court, by the John the King, when they moved to Brazil in 1808,
mm,
and he
mhm,
planted in the nowadays botanical gardens in Rio, but
mhm,
he forbid the stealing of the seed
mm,
because he wanted to have his exclusive garden. But there is a mythology in the era, legend, that people say that the enslaved people would climb the trunk, this huge trunk of the imperial palm tree during the night, steal the seeds, and they created kind of a parallel market. And with
mm,
this money, they bought their own freedom. So it was
mm.
also like a Shango intervention somehow, like a justice intervention.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, small stories I started to connect and to in a very storytelling way.
So they're all coming together in this book then.
Yes, it's kind of different essays of
Yes.
these stories and these and things I lived. Sometimes it's very like a diary.
Mm,
Sometimes it's more historical. Sometimes, yeah. And there is also three essays of three people I invited. One anthropologist that traveled with me to Nigeria that is also um, Ogian worshipper in
mm,
Brazil and in Nigeria. So he has this both views.
mhm,
There is Jumoke Sanwo, that is a Nigerian artist and cultural producer that lives in Lagos. And she's, for me, what is important to have her Yoruba perspective on what I was writing, departing from Yoruba way of seeing the world.
mm,
And there is also an essay of a friend that is an art historian about my works, because this was originally an exhibition, these footnotes to triangular photographies that turned into a book. And he writes about the works of like the exhibition, a bit of, yeah, kind of a critical or presentation text.
Which is how I first encountered you, is like through your work as an artist. And even the way you're describing this book, it still seems like a artwork, you know, the way it like almost mixed text and like intertextual and and mixed media too. Such an amazing creative way to approach a book. It's such a fantasy for me as a historian to do that. But yeah, so I first encountered you through the visual work and through the film, the short film that you'd made on the exhibition that was inspired by, so there's this exhibition, there's the film, and now there's the book. And can you talk about like how this all begins, you know, like what was the seed, you know, speaking of seeds, what was the seed of this this multi-generational evolution of this project now?
Yes, it's very, I think like now with this book, I found the right format for these ideas in this book, because in this book I combine the visual work and the writing. Because what happened was this exhibition I did in 2021, I would soon come to the beginning, but I begin by the middle. I did this exhibition in 2021. And when people were coming to the exhibition, I felt like doing a performance because I was always putting the footnotes in the works. I needed to explain so much because it's different cosmologies and all this literacy about the orishas and all this. I had to kind of tell a little bit so that the person could kind of enter the work deeper. And I felt like, okay, all these works, they are way more interesting if they have this storytelling behind. And then I decided to do the book. It came with the exhibition, more or less. No? And I always wrote a lot. I think writing is for me the language that I have more intimacy with since forever. All the works that I begin by writing, like writing a project or writing the ideas, and then I think about the format. So I decided to work with writing, really with writing. And this was always like this, like one of my first works that had a bit of like that went into the public is a tattoo that I have in my back that is a text without the words, just the comma, the final point, just the pause of telling a story without words, but always relating to the text. It was, let's say, since I moved into Germany, that was 2014, I started to be not more aware or more concerned about dealing with these stories of the unequal economic and political powers between the first world and the global south, as they call it. Because you feel like such a disparity by really living here, not only coming and seeing, but really living here and seeing the structure and how the society is built in one of the richest countries of Europe and of the world, and how there are so many injustices and all these that we know, but when you live in the daily life, you really see, and also this kind of awareness of, okay, I'm a Latin American woman in the world, you know, because this was not something that was worrying me before. And also because I'm a white person from Brazil and living in Brazil, like being white in Brazil is already a privileged position. So you don't really think about this in deep. No? And here I started to kind of turn these ideas into my main concern in the work. I wanted to deal with that. And yeah, so I did a work in 2015 that it's called Blurred Borders. And it was about these boats of people coming from Africa, Syria to Europe, arriving in Lampedusa. Because in 2015, there was a big crisis Lots of people were coming through Lampedusa, which is a tiny island of 5,000 people in
Mhm.
the very south of Italy.
Yeah.
So I went to this island in
Mm.
February 2015 to see what all these numbers meant. And the
Mm.
work started to be on these invisibilities because I was 2 weeks in this island.
Mm.
It's really a tiny island and also a poor island that lives on tourism and fishermen. And they have until today this camp where all the people that were coming by the boats were they were stuck in this camp. And in the week I was there, 1,200 people arrived by boat, and I
Wow.
didn't see nobody. And I
Mm.
was just like, I realized that they arrived because I was in the bakery and I saw on the television the reports on the people arriving. And I was
Wow.
just like, where are all these people? They are
Mm.
also invisible in this island
Mm.
because they don't want to talk about that. They want to kind of hide this crisis because they live on tourism. And when I was asking about this, they were like concerned that I was a journalist and they didn't want to tell me nothing. They didn't want to
Wow.
tell me where this camp was.
Wow.
You know, everything was very invisible. And this
Mm.
island was military bases of US until 94. And so there is all these kind of very high technology equipment in the island and lots of fences like forbidden to enter and protected and blah, blah, blah. It's kind of a lab, you know, because it's
Mm.
very close to Africa. And
Mm.
I was always imagining what is inside that is so forbidden for the audience to see, for the
Mm.
normal citizen to experience. So I did an exhibition on these invisibilities. Also, I discovered that this island has a very high electromagnetism in the air because of the radars, and this is also not good for the health.
Mm.
It's like as if you have your head inside a
Wait,
microwave, you know.
constantly. Yeah.
Yes. So I was just like, wow, it's all these, and I started to think of these fiber optics cables under the sea that we don't see, but they
Yeah.
exist. So the exhibition was all about these political invisibilities,
Very interesting.
departing from this. And then from then on, my work started to be always about like these stories that have to do with the dislocation of people,
Mm.
thinking on my own dislocation somehow, and these migrant
Mm.
communities. So I did two more big exhibitions, 2016, 2017, where I was like 2016, it was called Readings to Move the Center. And it was an exhibition that I talked to many African women from different countries living in Rio, because this was something
Oh, okay.
also that started to kind of come to my mind. Like there is a lot of African immigrants in Brazil, but nobody talks about that.
Mm.
Nobody knows these communities are totally invisible. And I
Mm.
never thought of this, that there is this flow of migration. They don't only go to US, they go to Brazil because it's easier to get a visa. And
Mm.
so I was asking these women about their favorite books. And in this way, I built kind of a decolonial
Mm.
library in the
Mm.
exhibition space. And
Amazing.
I was inviting writers every week for them to read the their stories, and Afro-Brazilian writers that also didn't have much space. Now they have, because it's like 7 years later, it's totally different.
Things changed.
The literature scene in Brazil, because all
Yeah.
these kind of Black Lives Matter movement is very strong there now
Yeah.
since the last 5 years, and
Yeah.
everything began to change. So, but back then it was still very invisible, 2016.
Mm.
So yeah, so I did a lot of works with women and all these migrant stories. And in these readings and researches, I discovered all this story that also some years ago was still very invisible in Brazil, about these Brazilian communities in this west coast of Africa, now in Nigeria, in Benin,
Mm.
and also in Ghana, these returnees
Did it
movement.
start with like a fictional account? Was it the Casa de Agua, or was it like more like a nonfiction that you first encountered these stories?
I encountered these stories first. I think it was like this. I read a book that you probably know that is very known, that's called Un Defeito de Cor, a
Mm.
color defect. Ana Maria Gonçalves is a fiction
Mhm.
about, it's a novel,
Mhm.
very big novel that kind of recounts the story of Brazil
Mhm.
through the perspective of one woman that's called Luisa Marin, that was a historical character, that was the mother of Luiz Gama. Luiz Gama was a like former enslaved person, son of a Portuguese and Luisa Marin.
Mhm.
And his father tried to sold him when he was 12, after his mother was forced to be apart, separated from him. And he became a lawyer, like when he was an adult, and an abolitionist. So he he let people in, more than 500 enslaved people in freedom, because he was fighting for that. Yeah, he's a very important historical character, and
Absolutely.
we have like documents about him and so on. About his mother, we don't have much documentation on her. But Ana Maria Gonçalves, this writer, she kind of invented in this lack of documentation, and she built this book that is very amazing. Like I read it, I remember I was reading until 3 a.m, you know, because it's really like taking you. And I think I'm not sure anymore, but I think it was my first encounter with this story of the Brazilian quarter in Lagos, and all this flow in the 19th century back to Africa, motherland. No? And then I started to dig a bit more into that. I found a very important book by Manuela Carneiro da Cunha. I don't know if you know her. She's a Portuguese anthropologist that lived in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. She lived in Ibadan because she had 2 small kids, and her husband was doing a postdoc there, and she was researching in the Ibadan National Archive, and she found all this. And then it started, like I started doing a small research on that, and I was invited for this residency in Salvador, 2018. That is from Goethe, organized by Goethe Institute, for 2 months. And I went as the German representation, because it's always like one German artist. Yeah, it's always one German artist or German-based artist, and three people from different countries. So I went together with Isaac Julian and Mark, that is his husband, that is a curator, with Adedoyin Oloshun, which became my priestess, but she was my neighbor in this residency. And Jonathan Doce, that is an artist, a young artist from Accra, that deals with virtual reality, documental virtual reality. So we were the 4 of us, 2 months there, but I was very close to Adedoyin Oloshun. And she, I went to Salvador to do this research, because all the boats that were going back to Africa back then, they were the known ones. They were departing from Salvador to the port.
It was the capital at the time.
It was the capital, yeah. And they were going to Lagos, directly. So lots of people also stayed in Lagos, although they had the plans. And so I went there to do this research, and I was trying to find a methodology that was not interviewing people, although I knew that there was some descendants of Romano da Conceição still alive in Salvador. There is the part of the family there still. I read some text by Milton Guran, which is a historian from Brazil that did a research on that, I think in the 90s or 2000. He has a book on that. But I didn't want, I wanted to deal with the archives that I found.
Right.
So I did this, this was in the very beginning of the residency. I thought I would be 2 months on that, but after Adedoyin arrived, she arrived a bit later, like 1 month later. She just changed all my research, because she was bringing me to something that was kind of alive in front of me, which was the meeting of these priestess of Oshun coming from the Oshobo, sacred forest to Salvador, and all the Candomblé temples were receiving her, and I was a witness of these encounters.
Wow.
And I was just like, I had to deal with this. That is just like a gift
Right
to
there.
me, and I
Yeah.
need to honor this gift,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
bring it back to the world, because for me it was just like, oh my God, I'm a witness of a historical encounter here, of these
Absolutely.
people, of these places, and I need to do something with that. Like I need
Mm,
to kind of document it in my own way,
mm. So
and
then,
then
you came back to the, the Romana de Conceição story later. Is that what happened? So you first encountered it at that point, but you don't have time to sit with it. And
no, I before going to the residency, like in the preparation for the residency, I was researching a lot on these stories of the Brazilian quarter, and then I found this article in this O Cruzeiro, because this was a very read magazine in Brazil in the 50s, the most read one, and it was based in Rio, but it was national and distributed nationally. And now the National Library in Rio, they digitalized all the archive of this magazine. So I found this volume from 63, which is a very special period because it was the only year of João Goulart, which was a president kind of that meant the opening of Brazil. But then he was killed. And in 64, the military dictatorship re-began.
Yeah.
But it was this special moment also because Nigeria was recently independent, and Brazil installed the first embassy in Nigeria. And and then they kind of used this Romana da Conceição character to promote this false idea of the racial democracy of Brazil, because this was a way of tighten the relationship with Nigeria, to say, we are a mixed country and we have lots in common. And they use this kind of character because they paid her flights back to Brazil after 63 years, or I don't know.
And that's Paulinha Alberto's argument, right? That it was like a kind of a political theater.
Yes, exactly. But
But
still,
I mean,
think
for
like
her, it wasn't. I mean, do you think for her it was? I mean,
no, I think for her it was an opportunity to go back to Brazil after 63 years. And for her, I think the things are ambivalent, like we all are, like there is the good and the bad side.
Yeah.
It's just good to be aware of where you're put in this trap,
Yeah.
But I think it was good for her. I think it was not bad, but it was medialized, used.
Yeah.
And
was it also remembered, or was it forgotten? Because I feel like in Nigeria, or in Lagos at least, there's a lot of, there's an awareness that there's like a Brazilian a community that came from Brazil, like a freed people, and they have this history, etc. But sometimes I don't think that in the popular culture there's like a very fine-grained kind of nuanced awareness, not to the level of like an individual story, So this is like it's so remarkable because it's this individual story of Romana, and her the entire life cycle, the things, the way that her life cycle, the life itinerary, I would even call it. And in one way, it's so spectacular because you said it's in the major magazine in Brazil. But is it also one of these things that becomes invisible, or is it?
To be very honest, I think nobody in Brazil still today knows about this bigger picture of the story, that there was people, like lots of people coming back to Africa during slavery times, that they don't even know that there were middle class of Black people during slavery times. All these stories that are stories of resistance somehow, they are very invisible until today. Like nobody knows. Like I didn't learn in school even about the Malays revolt of 1835 that is major. We don't really had this in school. Now I think it starts to change because during the first Lula presidency, the African studies were mandatory in the public schools. So I think they started to address, and there is more consciousness about this importance. No? But all my education was towards Europe. Like, we are Europeans. I didn't even know I was not Western, you know? For me, I was Western. I arrived here, I realized, okay, I'm Westernized, but not Western.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. And now, I mean, I guess even like the work, like the digitization that's happening with the magazines, but even the work that people like you are doing, you know, in, you know, in the visual arts context, but also in text, is contributing to a new library for a new understanding, a new relationship to the history.
Totally. I think we as artists are also responsible for rewriting history somehow, because we deal with documentation and the past is not frozen. No? We can change the past when we looked into other perspectives, other documentations, other stories. And I think this was what I was trying to do, because I was also fascinated by this character of Roman, and I said, okay, I have to retell the story and bring it to another platform, which is the visual art.